So the last point I was trying to make before I got cut off is that in postscript, Kierkegaard, through the voice of Climacus, is simply trying to say why indirect communication is necessary for ethical and religious discourse, which is based on this sort of incongruous ontological nature of the human self as a synthesis of the infinite and the finite. But there's another sense of irony which necessitates indirect communication for Kierkegaard, and that is the social reality of Christendom. So Kierkegaard was living in 19th century Denmark, where everybody basically thought that they were Christians by virtue of being a Danish citizen. And because Denmark was a Christian country, right? Lutheranism was the official church of Denmark, and therefore cultural form of Christianity was rampant, and people really did not understand what it means to be a Christian. And Kierkegaard really understood his life's task is to bring the true understanding of Christianity back to what he called a pagan Christendom in Denmark. So then there's a second sense of irony that necessitates indirect communication. That is to say, that when the hearer or the reader is in the grips of some kind of an illusion or delusion, then you cannot directly challenge and directly challenge the person to see their errors. They will get offended and they'll simply dismiss you. Okay, and therefore you have to use much more indirect method. Again, his inspiration was Socrates, who in fact used indirect method in order to expose the conversation partner's ignorance. So let me just read the third quote. By taking place in the form of an imaginary construction, the communication creates for itself an opposition, and the imaginary construction establishes a chasmic gap between reader and author and fixes the separation of inwardness between them, so that a direct understanding is made impossible. So what he's trying to say is that, yes, the reader is in the grip of illusion. In other words, Christianity is just an imaginary idea. It only exists in their mind, in their sort of imagination, rather than something that exists in their own lives, in their emotions, in their not only in their intellectual understanding, but in their emotions, in the way that they make choices, commitment, the whole of life. And therefore, he must use an indirect method. So there are all these reasons why Kierkegaard feels like he needs to use indirect method. So number one, again, this sort of infinite and finite disconnect within the human self, and therefore ethical task is this perpetual striving, and therefore the form of the communication must conform to that. And then also the fact that there is no teacher or learner, everyone is equal, and therefore the author cannot assert their own authority and try to directly communicate ethical ideals to their readers, learners, if they don't have the appropriate religious authority. And so Kierkegaard certainly had the notion that the apostle, people who have the direct revelation from God, have the authority to directly communicate the revelation, or ordained ministers. I think Kierkegaard believed in institutional authority, the legitimacy of institutional authority, and so ordained pastors have that authority. But the problem with the Danish pastors in his day is that even though they were properly ordained, they really did not understand the task of preaching. and spiritual awakening, to cause spiritual awakening. So they were sort of these wannabe professors, and also they did not live the kind of lifestyle that would bring about this authority. So, and then finally, the irony of Christendom, that people thought they were Christians, but then that is incongruous, contradictory to the actual ideal of what it means to be a Christian. Okay, so moving on to the next work, the point of view for my work as an author, I'd say what Kierkegaard says in that work concerning the mode of communication further clarifies Climacus's theory just explained. So in the first quote, he says this: every once in a while, a religious enthusiast appears. He makes an assault on Christendom. He makes a big noise, denounces nearly all as not being Christians, and he accomplishes nothing. He does not take into account that an illusion is not so easy to remove. No, an illusion can never be removed directly, and basically only indirectly. So this shows that Kierkegaard's understanding of why the religious communicator must use indirect communication, at least one without the proper authority, is confirmed here. In the second quote, the indirect communication is a true Christian invention. It cannot be practiced without fear and trembling, only in true self-denial. Now, this is interesting because this gives us a kind of an inside look into what Kierkegaard thought of this mode of indirect communication as coming from not only, I'm sorry, so the indirect communication is not only just a methodology, just a communicative technique, but rather it is actually a lifestyle. So this shows really the rigor with which Kierkegaard applied the truth that he understood. So if one must communicate in the right way using indirect communicative method, because of the infinite moral nature of the subject matter of morality or religion, then the author or the speaker must live according to that that ideal. And so true self-denial and fear and trembling is just Kierkegaard's word for genuine faith, right? Faith that does not simply rest on God's grace, but infinitely strives towards it, knowing that you cannot meet it and therefore you will need God's grace. And then the final quote, I have now figured out that the situation was dialectically right for using indirect communication again. Although I was devoting myself exclusively to religious writing, I dare to count on these daily drenchings of rabble barbarism as negatively supporting, on their having an adequate cooling effect, so that the religious communication would not become much too direct, or would not much too directly gain adherence for me. The reader could not directly relate himself to me because I now had in place, instead of the incognito of the aesthetic, the danger of laughter and grins, which scare away most people. So Kierkegaard is looking back at the recent events, and this is something called the Corsair affairs. Around the time that Kierkegaard wrote what he thought was going to be the final work, publication that he was going to do, namely the concluding unscientific postscript. So Kierkegaard thought that this writing this like nearly 700-page work is everything that he needed to say to Christendom to awaken, especially those who are in the know, right? The bishops and the pastors and the theology faculty and so on. And then he was going to disappear into some rural town and become a parish pastor somewhere where he's not very well known. But that plan changed when he became the subject of political satire. There was a magazine that published all these political satires using all kinds of pseudonyms because, of course, there was definitely in 19th century Denmark. There was censorship, and so on and so forth. And Kierkegaard somehow became the object of their political satire, and they just mercilessly pilloried him and made fun of him. And it was so bad that that when he took a walk around the city, which he loved to do daily, that people would just giggle and when they saw him, and therefore he was really alienated from the public and society, larger society, and he therefore underwent enormous amount of suffering. But then that indicated to him that there was more writing for him to do, and that God was not finished with him as an author. And therefore, he saw that as a sign that he should continue to write. And when he says, the situation was dialectical right for using indirect communication again, because he had been using writing a lot of religious discourses under his own name, not using pseudonyms, and sort of writing basically a kind of philosophically rich sermons, what he called the upbuilding discourses. But he saw the need to use indirect communication again. That means that he was going to use the super Christian pseudonym called the Anticlimacus. And this is also very important because when he says, instead of the incognito of the aesthetic, what he means by that is that when he was writing all these pseudonymous works, he did so that he could hide behind the pseudonyms. And then the readers would deal with the pseudonyms rather than him. First of all, that they would not believe what he says just because he said it, right? So the reader would not believe something that they read on the authority of Kierkegaard, but rather they would wrestle with the content of the writing through these pseudonyms who are in fact professing that they are not Christian. And so the readers are left with the ideas themselves rather than the ideas plus the author. And so that the authority of the author may not ever interfere with the readers grappling with the ideas themselves. And then they would accept the ideas based on the authority of truth itself that they grasp. But now the situation is such that, so in a sense, like the indirect communication is a way for the author to kind of disappear and leave the reader with the truth itself, the idea itself. So then at this point, when he is being mocked and made fun of in the eyes of the public, and the ill reputation has been brought on to Kierkegaard undeservingly, right? So then he has been sort of nullified in the eyes of his readers already. And therefore, he did not really need the incognito of the pseudonyms, the aesthetic. He was already kind of incognito by way of this ill reputation. And so this is really something important to keep in mind as we move to, I think, the final articulation of Kierkegaard's theory of communication. So, Anticlimacus. So I would say that Anticlimacus's theory of communication is consistent with Climacus, but it puts Climacus's theory in sharper relief because of Christ, Christologically. Here's how he explains it. Says, in practicing Christianity, thus there is a contradiction that nevertheless makes direct communication indirect. That is, makes direct communication impossible. So when he says contradiction, he means he's referring to the contradiction that is the God-man, Christ. So in the earlier work, under the same pseudonym, Johannes Climacus, he wrote a book called Philosophical Fragments, where he identified the incarnation of Christ as the absolute paradox that the reason, human intelligence cannot understand. It goes far beyond a human understanding. And so using that sort of same thought, he says that Christ, the person, is a contradiction. because he is God in the flesh. The infinite dwells in the finite. The eternal dwells in the temporal. Human mind cannot understand that. So the God in the flesh, no matter what he says, no matter what he does, the communication, whether through some divine miracles or some preposterous sayings of Christ, which would be totally crazy or preposterous if a mere human being said it, like such as the Father and I are one, right? Jesus says that. That's basically equating yourself with God and directly saying that I am God, essentially. Now, when Kierkegaard understands that because of Christ's this ontologically dual nature, which is a contradiction to the human mind, no direct communication is possible because this person cannot be understood by the human mind. And therefore, no matter how big a miracle he does, it's going to give someone a pause. Someone's not going to say, oh, this miracle, therefore God. It would totally stun the observer because what you see in front of you, right? If you received just a utterly amazing miracle, then what you see in front of you is just a mere human being, an ordinary carpenter from a small town called Nazareth. To say that, so then you're encountering this divine power in the human form, and therefore it's an utterly contradictory thing, and therefore it creates that space. What Kierkegaard calls the possibility of offense, which also means the possibility of faith. So it gives freedom to the observer of that miracle or the hearer of the communication, I and the Father are one, to make a choice to be offended and walk away and call him a blasphemer or a devil, or fall down and worship him as God and have faith. So that's what he means by the fact that there is no direct communication possible for Christ, anything that comes from Christ. Second quote, and only the sign of contradiction can do this. It draws attention to itself and then it presents a contradiction. There's something that makes it impossible not to look. And look as one is looking, one sees as in a mirror, one comes to see oneself. Or he who is the sign of contradiction looks straight into one's heart while one is staring into the contradiction. The sign of contradiction, once again, that is Christ the person. When you encounter Christ, whether you're reading the gospel or whether you're hearing the gospel preached to you, maybe for the first time, this figure, this person of Christ, is such a contradictory figure to our rational mind that, again, we're kind of stunned. It's almost like a train wreck we just have to look at. But the decision is not made for us. It's not some deductive reasoning. We have to choose. There's a possibility of offense or faith. And also it brings up, so Christ is like a mirror to us, right? Because he is this God in the flesh, but he suffers. He willingly suffers for humanity. So the God-man, the holy man, suffers in the sinful man's place. And that is a kind of a mirror held up when we see Christ, when we hear about Christ, and that brings to our consciousness who we are as this sort of man God, a man trying to be God, trying to pretend that we are God, right? In our sin, in our sinful rebellion, right? So then that mirroring creates the space that we are face to face with the deepest truth about ourselves, our sinfulness, and then the moral ideal exemplified in Christ that we do not meet, that we cannot meet, that we have refused to meet, we went against. And therefore that juxtaposition causes the soul the possibility of choice for offense or faith. The third quote, they discover here a self-contradiction which in the service of the good is genuine self-denial. The good man does his very best to maintain his incognito, and his incognito is that he is far lowlier than he really is. The incognito is his free decision. So the incognito for Christ is, of course, his human flesh, right? God is hiding behind the human flesh. He's lowered himself than what he really is. So that is the same dynamic, same dialectic that is involved in indirect communication, as far as Kierkegaard is concerned. So when he's writing under the pseudonyms who are mere poets, and he's writing these aesthetic pieces with irony and humor without authority, then Kierkegaard himself is sort of lowering himself and uses those pseudonyms, aesthetic pseudonyms, as his incognito, to interfere with the reader's true understanding and appropriation of the religious truth that he's trying to communicate in this indirect way. And finally, probably most importantly, Anticlimacus talks about two types of indirect communication. So the first type, he says this: indirect communication can be an art of communication in redoubling the communication. The art consists in making oneself, the communicator, into a nobody, purely objective, and then continue placing the qualitative opposites in a unity, to place jest and earnestness together in such a way that the composite is a dialectical knot, and then to be a nobody oneself. So here, it's the idea, again, I just explained. And so this really describes what Kierkegaard was doing in his earlier writing, when he was using all these pseudonyms to hide behind, to sort of minimize his own authority as an author, to leave the readers with the ideas themselves. He has this idea of leaving the reader with himself. But the interesting thing is, there is a second type of indirect communication, which is actually direct communication, but it is made indirect through what he calls the relation between the communication and the communicator. There is a reduplication of the communication. To exist in what one understands is to reduplicate. In other words, or let me just read this last quote. If, however, the communicator himself is dialectically defined, and not just his communication, his own being having been determined by reflection, then all direct communication is impossible. Because of the communicator, the communication contains a contradiction. It becomes indirect communication. It confronts you with a choice whether you will believe him or not. So, what's going on here is that the second type of indirect communication, which is actually direct communication, so just think of a typical sermon, right, where the communicator is exhorting or trying to convict the hearers of some sin, and then exhorting them to submit to Christ and for his grace, and so on and so forth, right? This is a direct communication form. Now, normally this would not work, actually, unless it is in this way, where it becomes indirect by the relation between the communication, the direct religious discourse, and the communicator, the speaker or the writer, because the communicator has striven to live this moral life, this incredible and infinite ethical demand in self-denial and with fear and trembling. It is dialectically defined and has become so close to imitating Christ that the communicator becomes one with the communication. Right? The message, so the communicator becomes one with the message because of his religious upbringing with a whole lot of suffering, whole lot of self-denial. So this is very interesting because Christ, this type of indirect communication applies to Christ preeminently, but then the followers of Christ, such as the apostles, the prophets, who approximate Christ in their moral striving, and so in the imitation of Christ, they get to a point where they will be able to use a direct method of communication, but it will have the appropriate effect of indirect communication, of leaving the subject matter, the idea, the moral truth with the hearer or the reader by themselves, apart from the communicator themselves. And so I think this explains what goes on in the later part of Kierkegaard's authorship, where Kierkegaard begins to address these religious matters directly, using direct communication method. And then ultimately, in the last 2 years of his life, he openly attacks the church. And at this point, I think he understands himself to be not an apostle, obviously not an ordained minister, but another category called a witness to the truth. And I think through all of his suffering and all of his also personal moral striving, he has come to that point, but he did not bring that upon himself, that call to attack the church. So that's why the journals. That's where the journals are really interesting and important. So Kierkegaard in journals talks a lot about someday in the future coming to the moment of witnessing to the truth. So in the first quote, it says, "If it seems to him, the maieutic communicator, the indirect communicator, the Socratic communicator, that he thereby produces no effect, then it can very likely be his duty, at least by way of experiment, to choose another form. But maybe it is also only his impatience to demand quick results instead of having faith." Just skipping, yet a more direct form which runs parallel to this can also be necessary. So I think he has always understood, because he understood the religious or the spiritual reality of man, and then also the right communicative method, that at some point in the future, he would have to use a direct communicative method, but like a prophet, railing against the society, the church, or Israel. But it would not be his own decision, that it would have to be based on faith. In other words, that he would have to have some kind of revelation. So there was a really clear understanding what Kierkegaard was doing when he said all these things, which surprised everybody. The second quote, there will come moments when I, certainly not from my own inclination, but prompted by something higher, must set between ourselves the awakening of misunderstanding. So he's kind of writing to his imaginary reader. There are at least some small following, right, who think that Kierkegaard is this great religious author. But in this last act of direct communication, this will cause such misunderstanding, such offense, even between him and his loyal followers. And lastly, towards the later part of his life, he writes these in his journal. Yet the communication of essentially Christian must end finally in witnessing. The maieutic cannot be the final form because Christianly understood, the truth does not lie in the subject as Socrates understood it, but in a revelation which must be proclaimed. But since Christianity is still Christianity, the one who uses the maieutic must become a witness. Again, this is very much his self-understanding. So the first part of his authorship, he understood, he used the maieutic method, which is the Socratic method, the indirect method. But then he knew that at some point in the future, as he was becoming more and more spiritually mature and more spiritually sanctified and becoming more like Christ, that he would have to directly proclaim that message. And therefore that attack would have to come. Second quote, "For me, the entire operation has been a matter of being honest with myself, whether and to what extent I wanted to become a Christian in the strictest sense. But when the one who enters upon this operation is himself in the situation of having to determine whether he actually wants to become a Christian in the strictest sense, this tactic cannot and ought not to be maintained to the end." Again, this is just the absolute authenticity and the self-honesty of Kierkegaard. He understood the highest moral ideal that was Christianity, and therefore he never wanted to claim that he was a Christian, simply that he was becoming a Christian. And therefore he used the indirect method of communication so richly, so readily in his first period. But he also understood, according to this dialectic of communication, that direct communication was going to be inevitable as he becomes more and more like Christ and become a truth witness who would have to call out the church for what it really is, the shell of a church that is really not living up to the standard of what Christianity is, and they're not even willing to confess that they're not meeting the standard. So I began with the question of how shall I engage in academic religious philosophy once again? And I don't have a clear answer, but one thing clear to me is that whatever I do and write, that I must strive to be an honest thinker and writer as Kierkegaard sought to be. Thank you for listening.